Welcome to Washington Today for Monday, March 27th, 2023. I'm Gary Starkoff. Thanks a lot for joining us today. President Biden said that gun violence is, quote, ripping at the very soul of the nation today, and calling for Congress to pass an assault weapons ban following another school shooting, this time at a private Christian elementary school in Nashville, Tennessee. Members of the House and Senate are also reacting to today's shooting, with some echoing the president's calls for more action to stop gun violence. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced a delay in his judicial overhaul plan earlier today, saying he wants to give time to seek a compromise with his opponents. Meanwhile, President Biden has shared his concerns about the plan directly with Prime Minister Netanyahu. We'll hear about their conversation coming up. Here's more now on the Nashville shooting. At least 3 children and 3 adults are dead. Police say the school teaches preschool through 6th grade, and that the shooter was a 28-year-old Nashville woman. She was killed during gunfire with police. Her identity and motive have yet to be confirmed. According to statistics from the Gun Violence Archive, this is the 129th mass shooting in the U.S. this year. Here's what President Biden, who was speaking at a White House Women's Small Business Summit, had to say.
Before I begin to speak, the reason I spent a little time with the kids, I just want to speak very briefly about the school shooting in Nashville, Tennessee. You know, Ben and I have been doing this our whole careers, it seems. And it's just, it's sick. You know, we're still gathering the facts of what happened and why. And we do know that as of now, there are a number of people who did not make it, including children. It's heartbreaking, a family's worst nightmare. And I want to commend the police who responded incredibly swiftly, within minutes, to end the danger. We're monitoring the situation really closely, Ben, as you know, and we have to do more to stop gun violence. It's ripping our communities apart, ripping the soul of this nation, ripping at the very soul of the nation. And we have to do more to protect our schools so they aren't turned into prisons. You know, the shooter in this situation reportedly had 2 assault weapons and a pistol, 2 AK-47. So I call on Congress again to pass my assault weapons ban. It's about time that we begin to make some more progress, but there's more to learn. But I just wanted to send my concern and hearts out to so many parents out there. I've been to so many of these sites, as Ben knows, by virtually every one. And one of the things you folks should, I know you do know, but you should focus on. You know, just like when in the military, my son was in Iraq for a year, other places, there's so many members of the military coming back with post-traumatic stress after witnessing the violence and participating in it. Well, these children, these teachers, should be focusing on their mental health as well. And so I'm grateful anyway. Sorry to start off that way, but I couldn't begin without acknowledging what happened.
From earlier today at the White House, and statements from Tennessee's congressional delegation, Republican Andy Ogles, who represents the area in the House of Representatives, saying that he and his family are devastated by the tragedy. And, quote, "We are sending thoughts and prayers to the families of those lost. As a father of 3, I am utterly heartbroken by this senseless act of violence." He also, in his statement, thanked first responders. Republican Senators Marsha Blackburn and Bill Hagerty both adding that they are heartbroken and ready to assist in the effort with federal, state, and local officials. And today's violence was also on the mind of Senate Majority Whip Dick Durbin. Here's part of what he had to say earlier on the floor.
Today, yet another American community is in shock and grief after yet another American mass shooting. This morning, a shooter entered the Covenant School in Nashville, Tennessee, reportedly armed with 2 assault rifles and a handgun. This is an elementary school for students in preschool through the 6th grade. The children are as young as 3 and 4 years old. Upon entering the school, the shooter opened fire, killing at least 3 staff members and 3 students. I cannot begin to imagine what the families and school community are feeling at this moment. We send our prayer and condolences, and we are certainly grateful for the first responders who were dispatched to the school within minutes and ran toward the sound of gunfire. But once again, thoughts and prayers are not enough. These mass shootings, especially targeting little children, are happening with sickening regularity in this nation. This could be the 129th mass shooting since this year 2023 began. 129 mass shootings in America, and we are fewer than 90 days into this calendar year. That's more than one mass shooting per day. What is a mass shooting? 4 victims, either shot or killed in an incident. Last year, Congress took some important steps on gun safety reform with Bipartisan Safer Communities Act and the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization. The Judiciary Committee that I serve did a lot of work on these measures, and I was happy to support both of them. But as today's shooting in Nashville, Tennessee demonstrates, there is more work to be done. The fact that this is a daily occurrence in America is unconscionable.
Senate Majority Whip Dick Durbin of Illinois speaking on the floor today. He has been a longtime supporter of an assault weapons ban. Also today in the Senate, continuing work on legislation to repeal authorizations for use of military force against Iraq. With more on this, here's Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer.
This afternoon, the Senate will vote on cloture on AUMF repeal, bringing us one step closer to finally repealing the 1991 and 2002 Iraq AUMFs. Once cloture is invoked this afternoon, we'll hold a few more votes on additional Republican amendments. Senators should then expect to vote on final passage of the Iraq AUMF repeal as soon as tomorrow. Repealing the Iraq AUMFs has been a good and reasonable process here on the floor. We had a strong bipartisan vote on cloture last week. We're allowing Republican amendments, and most importantly, we aren't being dilatory because this is something a majority of senators want to get done. I hope this can be a method, a pattern of what we do in the future. We are willing to allow amendments, but we must move forward and cannot be dilatory and cannot have amendments so extraneous that they just bog down the whole process. That's what happened on this AUMF bill is a good model for us for the future to get things done with bipartisan cooperation. And on this bill, I want to thank Senators Kaine and Young, the chairman and the ranking members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and all the co-sponsors of this legislation for their work on this measure. Now, the hold on senior military nominations. Defense readiness is impossible without military commanders in place to execute our national defense strategy. Senators have regularly worked together to confirm routine military nominees quickly, ensuring no lapses in the work of our military. But right now, 160 military promotions, 160. These are non-political. These are men and women who have worked their way up through the ranks and deserve promotion to general, to colonel, etc. But 160, including 5 three-star generals, are on hold because the senior senator from Alabama is holding them up because he can't get his way on blocking 160,000 women within the military from receiving health care. Blocking military choices is unprecedented, hasn't happened before, and it could weaken our national security. And the number of those who are blocked is going to grow even larger as new nominees are reported out of the committee.
Majority Leader Chuck Schumer on the floor earlier today. There is opposition to repealing the AUMF. Here's Texas Republican John Cornyn.
Given the growing threats from Iran, it would be absurd to toss this authorization out the window today. If Congress repeals the Iraqi war authorization, it prompts a lot of questions about what comes next. Without the 2002 AUMF, the president would lose the ability to contain Iran and its aggression. Iran's influence in the region would swell, and Iranian-backed militia would terrorize Syria and Iraq with impunity. Iran would be free to focus on its maniacal desire to destroy Israel, and without having to contend with the United States. It would be free to spend even more money financing terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. Russian influence in Syria would grow, giving Putin a launch pad to further project power into the Middle East. Our friends and allies, no longer safe with America at their side, could succumb to coercive partnerships with China, giving Xi Jinping another region in which to compete with the United States for global primacy. In short, passing this legislation would create a power vacuum in the Middle East that could be filled by Iran, Russia, and China. We'd be ceding the region back to competition after working for years to promote stability. Of course, there are costs to maintaining our position in the Middle East, but the cost-benefit analysis clearly shows that we have to leave every authority in place to defend American and allied interests in the Middle East. Over the last few decades, as I said a moment ago, America's relationship with Iraq has changed for the better. It's a valuable partner. We work together to support security for Iraq and the region as a whole. The U.S. military works with Iraqi forces to counter threats from Iran and to reduce its influence in the region. These authorizations for the use of military force are key to our continued success. And it also means that we will continue to work with the executive branch rather than have the executive branch rely strictly on the president's constitutional powers. They give the President of the United States the flexibility needed to counter these threats and the threats that they pose from Iran. We would be doing Iran a huge favor by repealing these AUMFs. So suffice it to say, Madam President, I oppose the effort to repeal this Iraqi war authorization, and I encourage my colleagues in the Senate to join me in that opposition.
Texas Republican John Cornyn speaking on the Senate floor earlier today about his opposition to repeal the authorization for use of military force in Iraq. And you heard Senator Schumer a moment ago mentioning the hold on military nominees by Senator Tommy Tuberville. He's a Republican of Alabama. Well, more on that. Senator Tuberville's been holding these nominations and promotions at the Pentagon in protest of its policy for paying for and allowing time off for servicewomen who pursue abortions. The Pentagon says, or Senator Tuberville says, that policy is immoral and an illegal expansion of its authority. Back in February, the Department of Defense put in place its policy of paying travel expenses for women who pursue abortions. The policy was announced last year and drew fierce opposition from Senator Tuberville at the time. You can see the full statements from Senators Durbin, Schumer, and Cornyn, and more on that from Senator Tuberville at cspan.org. And of course, the Senate is always live on C-SPAN 2. The Senate will also hold hearings this week on President Biden's proposed $6.9 trillion budget for fiscal year 2024, with testimony from Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas and Attorney General Merrick Garland. On Tuesday, federal banking leaders will testify before the Senate Banking Committee on the recent bank failures. Then on Wednesday, the former CEO of Starbucks, Howard Schultz, appears before the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee over complaints that Starbucks is preventing stores from unionizing. You get more schedule information at C-SPAN Radio, following us on Twitter at C-SPAN Radio, and also on the C-SPAN Now mobile video app. Now, over in the House, energy policy is on the agenda with a vote scheduled later in the week on a bill that will try to increase oil and gas production and speed up the federal permit approval process for energy and infrastructure projects. For more on that, we talked to Punchbowl News congressional reporter Max Cohen.
So this is the House Republican top legislation. They're labeling it H.R. 1, which shows its significance. It's really a plan, they say, to unleash American energy. It's a direct response to President Joe Biden, to Democrats they say are hampering American energy production. They want to ease the permitting process, make it easier to drill on federal lands, on state lands, just kind of a whole, they call it all of an above approach, making it more difficult for a president also to cancel an energy plan, such as Biden's plan to cancel the Keystone Pipeline.
So they have, as far as some of the elements of H.R. 1, it would promote natural gas exports. It would ease some of those permitting related to critical minerals. It would repeal the Democrats' methane fee, also would limit the ability of states to block projects by using a section of the Clean Water Act, and then it would codify the ERA's rules during the Trump administration to speed up reviews. As far as widespread support about Republicans, are they generally on board, all Republicans, with this, and are there dissenters or are there concerns?
Yeah, it's our understanding that this is going to be pretty widespread Republican support for this. This is nothing too out of the mainstream of the Republican position. You know, last week with the Parents' Bill of Rights, which had I think 5 Republicans voted against this in the House. I don't expect to see any Republicans voting against this H.R. 1 package at this time. But in terms of Democrats, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has said this is dead on arrival in the Senate, so don't hold your breath on getting this passed throughout Congress.
Is it about the overall approach that has no Senate chances, or are there individual aspects where the Senate could agree on some of the elements of this proposal?
Well, it's a good question. There was some talk of permitting reform last Congress with Senator Joe Manchin leading those calls, but there's never enough consensus among Democrats and Republicans to reach a 60-vote threshold. There were competing Republican and Democratic plans. Out of everything proposed in H.R. 1, I'd say the permitting reform probably has the best chance to reach some sort of compromise between the chambers, but as we saw last Congress, that is a hard challenge, I think, to get across the finish line.
You mentioned the passage of the parental rights bill last week. It will go probably nowhere in the Senate. You said that the chances are this will do the same. What's the point Republicans are making, especially with these initial bills, and bringing them forward if there's no chance in the Senate?
Sure, you know, they won the majority. They want to say to their voters, look, we're doing something with it. We promised we were going to reform the way Americans deal with energy. This is connected to political points over gas prices, over heating costs, you know, over kind of cost of living. And a central point of the Republican economic plan is we need to lower inflation. How do we do it? We unleash American energy. So it's a messaging bill as much as anything. You know, Republicans will say it's good policy, but in a divided government, the reality is it's messaging. A
messaging bill on parents' rights last week, a messaging bill on energy rights or at least energy this week. What other messaging bills can we expect in the next couple of months?
Well, I think for now, these are the low-hanging fruit they want to get done early on. We're going to see some more difficult fights in the future over immigration, over border security. Those bills are not a slam dunk. You know, GOP leaders have already had to postpone a markup of a border security and immigration package, which was supposed to be in the Judiciary Committee, Homeland Security Committee. That's now being postponed to after the April recess. So I think how I'm viewing this is the Republicans are passing their signature proposals, the ones they know they have the votes for. We come back after the April recess, getting down to the harder work, including the immigration package, and then I think all eyes will turn to government spending, the debt limit, in that coming fight.
We saw Republicans meet in Orlando last week to talk about these various issues that they want to present. What's the mood amongst the caucus, especially in these first few months under the leadership of Speaker McCarthy?
Sure. I think one of the main takeaways I had is they're in a good mood. They're in the majority. Everyone saw the scenes in the first week of January with the elongated speaker race. That seems to be very much behind Republicans in this moment. McCarthy was flanked by his leadership team at this retreat, and, you know, talking to even some of the Freedom Caucus skeptics, there does not seem to be widespread anger or disapproval among the, Never Kevin group currently. So things are going better, I think, for McCarthy than they looked in the first week of January. And there's a widespread optimism that they have the majority. They have all the chairmanships. They're sending out subpoenas. They feel like they're hitting a roll now, but I would caution that the easy stuff has happened. Now the harder stuff happens. You have to raise the debt limit. They have to negotiate the spending deal with President Biden. I think there are some maybe warning signs ahead for the majority.
We saw the president call for Republicans to release their budget in the light of him releasing his. Where are Republicans on that?
It's a great question. You know, President Joe Biden was late in his budget. Republicans will remind you that of every opportunity. So when you ask them, they'll say, hey, we're in no rush. Biden was late with his. Currently, there seems to be a bit of a discrepancy between House Budget Committee Chair Jody Arrington and Speaker McCarthy. Arrington has said he's going to release a term sheet of everything he wants to see the White House give in return for Republicans voting to raise the debt limit. McCarthy was asked about this on Friday, and he said he didn't know what Arrington was talking about. So a little bit of confusion. You know, there will be a hearing this week that Arrington is holding, hopefully provide some more clarity. But, you know, they're crafting their budget. I spoke with Arrington in Orlando, and he said it's a complex process. It's going to take a little while, but I think we can expect a counter proposal in the coming month.
And by the meaning of term sheet, a list of demands from Jody
Exactly.
Arrington. What kind of things is he looking for from that?
Well, a central thing is Republicans want to return spending to fiscal year 2022 levels. So that would equate to around a $130 billion cut from where things are now. And that's a big conversation. They want the White House to agree to cuts in federal spending. That is the main issue at play here. The White House and Democrats are responding, and they said that would amount to cutting money for working families, for veterans, for seniors. So we're going to have to see the Republican proposal. Their response is as well, we can cut waste. That won't affect these groups of people.
Punchbowl News congressional reporter Max Cohen on today's Washington Journal. You can see more at cspan.org/Washington Journal.
We will never accept a civil war. We are about to have a clash within the Israeli society, and we are facing a crisis that is a real threat to the national unity of our people, and it is quite important and it's quite necessary to behave with all responsibility. I have read yesterday a call for dialogue on all issues, in all causes, and we need to be within this pot to have the dialogue, as most of our friends have accepted this matter, the dialogue matter, and whenever we have the capabilities to avoid a civil war, we need to go for this. At the same time, we need to give ourselves some time in order to reach a point where we can vote during the second session of the Knesset.
Part of the speech made on Israeli TV earlier today by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announcing a delay in his judicial overhaul plan, saying he wants to give time to seek a compromise with his opponents. The announcement comes after tens of thousands of Israelis demonstrated outside the Knesset on Monday, and workers across the country launched a nationwide strike. According to National Security Council spokesman John Kirby, President Biden recently shared his concerns about the plan directly with Prime Minister Netanyahu.
As he approaches these conversations, or as he approached the conversation with the Prime Minister, and as we approach just from an administration, it's really from a place of friendship and deep respect for the democratic institutions that both our countries share. And that's where it came from. And the president was very forthright with Prime Minister Netanyahu, talking about this terrific relationship and reiterating that democratic societies are strengthened by the whole idea of checks and balances, as well as the fact that any fundamental change to a democratic system really ought to be pursued with the broadest possible base of popular support. And so he stressed the need to Prime Minister Netanyahu to find a way forward that was based on compromise and that could result in that sort of consensus support. But he was very clear. And again, it really does come from a position of respect and friendship for Israel and everything that Israel stands for, not only in the region, but to the whole world.
And does President Biden ultimately believe that these judicial reforms are largely motivated by Netanyahu's own sort of personal and political motivations? And if he does, has he explicitly shared that concern with the Prime Minister and his friend?
I'll just say that he has definitely shared his concerns over this proposed legislation with Prime Minister Netanyahu directly. And it really does come from a place, as I said, of supporting the very idea of checks and balances and the idea of consensus support. That's where the president's main concerns come from.
John Kirby also said the president isn't concerned that the protests will deteriorate into something worse.
The president believes that one of the great things about Israel is its strong history of democracy. And, you know, in many ways, you're seeing those same traditions, even though we have concerns over this pending legislation, you're seeing the same dedication to public debate play out even today in terms of protest activity. The president is not concerned that Israel is going to devolve into any kind of civil war.
National Security Council spokesman John Kirby on a conference call with reporters today. You're listening to Washington Today.
Live Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern on C-SPAN Radio. Senate Banking Committee holds a hearing on the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. Witnesses will be officials from the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, Federal Reserve, and Treasury Department. And live Tuesday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern, Attorney General Merrick Garland testifies before a Senate Appropriations Subcommittee about the department's fiscal year 2023 budget request. C-SPAN Radio is 90.1 FM in the Washington, D.C. metro area. Anywhere on your smart speaker, say play C-SPAN Radio.
Welcome back to Washington Today. More now from the Nashville school shooting. According to the Associated Press, the woman who police say committed the shooting was wielding 2 assault-style rifles and a pistol. She killed 3 9-year-old students and 3 adults at this private Christian school in Nashville earlier today. She was killed by police, believed to be a former student at the school known as the Covenant School where the shooting took place. They also have identified the victims. Evelyn Dykehouse, Hallie Scruggs, and William Kinney, all 9 years old, 3 of the victims. 2 adults, Cynthia Peak, who is 61, Catherine Kuntz, 60, and Mike Hill, age 61. The website of the Covenant School, which is a Presbyterian school founded in 2001, lists Catherine Kuntz as head of the school. That is also what her LinkedIn profile says. She has led the school since 2016. Vice President Kamala Harris is in Africa this week, and today she announced a major U.S. aid package to 5 African nations. Back here in Washington, Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with the Foreign Minister of Colombia, Alvaro Leiva, today to announce further cooperation between the 2 countries. And in campaign news, Texas Democratic Representative Sheila Jackson Lee has announced she is running for mayor of Houston. Representative Jackson Lee has represented Texas's 18th congressional district since 1995. She will not have to leave her seat in Congress to run. The election is set for November 7th. And Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren has announced her re-election campaign. She posted a video announcement on social media featuring prominent Massachusetts leaders and outlining her goals moving ahead. She is running for her 3rd term. More now on Vice President Harris's African aid package, speaking in Ghana's capital city of Accra. She announced aid to 5 West African countries to help them deal with violent extremism and instability. She's at the start of a week-long 3-nation tour of the continent. It's the latest in a series of visits by senior American officials as the U.S. seeks to counter growing Chinese and Russian influence on the continent. Here's Vice President Harris.
We appreciate your leadership in response to recent democratic backsliding in West Africa and standing up for democratic principles around the world. We also recognize Ghana's significant contributions in the Sahel, and I thank you for your leadership there. To help address the threats of violent extremism and instability, today I am pleased to announce $100 million in support of Benin, Ghana, Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, and Togo. Last week, President Joe Biden announced a strategic plan for coastal West Africa as part of the United States strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability. Today, funding and the announcement that I've just made will help implement that plan and will address security, governance, and development issues in the region. With regard specifically to the economy, I recognize the challenges Ghanaians are facing, especially in the wake of a global pandemic and the disruptions caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We welcome Ghana's commitment to reforming its economy to deliver sustainable and inclusive growth. We support Ghana's engagement with the IMF and will continue to push for all bilateral creditors to provide meaningful debt reduction for countries that need it, including Ghana. We must work together as an international community to ease the debt burden that is facing far too many countries. It is critical to do so to build long-term economic growth and prosperity, and to increase U.S. investment, a key priority for our administration, and in particular, private sector investment. Our partnership with Ghana is already strong, and today, Mr. President, I believe we strengthened it even more. I thank you for your gracious hosting of this important conversation and all of the work we will do going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Back here in Washington, Secretary of State Antony Blinken hosted the Foreign Minister of Colombia, Alvaro Leiva. The meeting was part of a regular series of meetings between the two countries called the U.S.-Colombia High-Level Dialogue. According to a State Department statement, the two are expected to talk about, quote, a range of issues including immigration, counter-narcotics, human rights and equity, and climate action. Here's more from Secretary Blinken.
Across the upcoming dialogue, we will focus on concrete steps to strengthen our cooperation and work to deliver tangible results for our people. So let me just take a few minutes to highlight some of the areas where we are going to work to do that. We'll continue working to help Colombia reach its ambitious climate goals, from providing ongoing technical assistance on wind and solar projects to strengthening protection of the Amazon. We'll expand pathways for farmers, for textile producers, and other small and medium-sized businesses in rural areas to get their products to global markets and reap the benefits of the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. Our dialogue will also focus, of course, on improving civilian security. For decades, we have worked together to strengthen cooperation on security and law enforcement, and that will continue. At the same time, we recognize that to sustainably reduce violence, we have to tackle the root causes of insecurity, like corruption, like impunity, impunity for crimes, human rights abuses, and the lack of economic opportunity. That's why we continue to partner on bolstering the rule of law and expanding access to justice. And it's also why USAID is investing $60 million over 5 years to expand opportunities for Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities. Ensuring equitable development is a central focus of the ethnic chapter of the 2016 Peace Accord. It recognizes that there can be no lasting peace without justice and equality for the country's underserved communities. Back in October, I joined Vice President Marquez at the extraordinary Fragmentos Museum. I had the honor of signing the United States Honors, the chapter's first international accompanier. Ambassador Murillo, who's here today, was with us in Bogota on that historic day. He's dedicated much of his life to giving voice to these communities, including the ethnic chapter. In the time since we signed on as an accompanier, the U.S. Embassy in Colombia, led by our charge, Paco Palmieri, who's with us here today as well, has dedicated a full team to supporting the ethnic chapter's implementation, building on our longstanding partnerships with both Colombia's government and with civil society.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken. You can see more at cspan.org. News of another train derailment late last night. Several cars on a Canadian Pacific freight train derailed in North Dakota. And according to thehill.com, some of the 31 rail cars involved in the disaster were carrying hazardous materials. And an initial assessment found a liquid asphalt leak at the derailment site, which is in rural Richland County, North Dakota. No injuries or fire was reported. And according to Canadian Pacific, there's no threat from the leak to waterways or public safety. The issue of rail safety was on the agenda at today's National League of Cities Congressional City Conference here in Washington. Here's David Sander, who is NLC First Vice President and a city councilman in Rancho Cordova, California.
This morning, I'm going to address an issue of critical importance to our nation's cities, towns, and villages, the issue of rail safety. Unfortunately, the derailment and environmental catastrophe that occurred in East Palestine, Ohio, was not unprecedented. More than 1,000 trains derail every year in the United States, all around our country. And with 140,000 miles of track crossing directly through thousands of our cities, municipalities, the severity of this recent derailment requires proactive steps that Congress can and should take now. We are encouraged by the introduction of the Bipartisan Rail Safety Act of 2023 in the Senate. This would improve rail safety, and the proposals in the House to expand the list of chemicals reported so that when derailments happen, first responders know what they're dealing with. This week, NLC sent a letter to Congress that was signed by more than 400 mayors and city council members. The letter details specific changes that we are calling for, including the following. Make the Federal Railroad Administration data available in order to assess the risk of hazardous materials that are on longer trains. Ensure fines are used first in the community that is impacted by the event. Expedite rail safety improvements and new technologies to reduce rail deaths and derailments. Expand the list of hazardous materials that are reported to state and local first responders. And you can imagine this being done by an app that a first responder could use when responding to a crisis. The data is available. We just need to be sure the federal agencies share it. We need to invest more in local experimentation for improving signs and signals that can reduce costs and increase safety in our crossings all across this country. And finally, we need to support the National Transportation Safety Board's rail safety recommendations and provide appropriate funding for them to do their jobs effectively.
That's David Sander, first vice president of the National League of Cities and a city councilman in Rancho Cordova, California. The NLC conference wraps up tomorrow. Other speakers today included First Lady Dr. Jill Biden, Massachusetts Democratic Representative Jim McGovern, and White House Senior Advisor and Infrastructure Coordinator Mitch Landry. You can see what they said at cspan.org. Finally, this week marks the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion in Iraq. And today at the American Enterprise Institute, Stephen Hadley, who was National Security Advisor under President George W. Bush, talked about the discussions that led up to the decision to go to war in Iraq. He spoke with AEI Senior Fellow Danielle Pletka.
Talk about who was there. If you asked me, based on what I've read alone, as opposed to having lived these years, I would say that there was a small cabal. I'm using that word intentionally, of people. The Vice President, Dick Cheney, who's on our board, full disclosure, and Paul Wolfowitz, who used to be one of our colleagues here at the American Enterprise Institute, and a small group of others who were agitating for this, who made the case aggressively and finally brought the president around. What actually happened?
Well, I'm not sure they were certainly agitating for it, but I'm not sure they brought the president around. I think the president came around with the kind of thinking that I just described. Remember, there had been an effort by that cabal, if you will, to say right after 9/11 that if it was a global war on terror, we shouldn't just go after the Taliban in Afghanistan so we could get at al-Qaeda, which they were protecting, but we should also go after terror someplace else. How about Iraq? And President Bush rejected that advice, and partly because Colin Powell argued at the time, if you have 9/11 and you go into Afghanistan, the American people will understand that, because that's the locus of where the planning for 9/11 occurred. But if you go into Iraq, Americans are going to scratch their heads and say, what's that about? Contrary to popular belief, we did not believe Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11. You couldn't tie it in that direction. So how would you explain going into Iraq? So that agitation was rejected by the president, but I think the president came to where I described. A lot of administrations, when you come in, you've won an election, the adrenaline is up, and you think, well, by golly, what the guys did before was a mistake. We're writing on a blank sheet of paper. We knew we weren't writing on a blank sheet of paper so far as Iraq is concerned. And I think one of the things that's not appreciated enough, if I think about it, is because you're not writing on a blank sheet of paper, and when you have a long-standing crisis like Iraq, I don't think people appreciate how much prior decisions have actually narrowed your options. So in the end of the day, Bush was faced with exactly the choice I described. Either say that whole 12 years of effort by the entire international community was a mistake, or to use that force he accumulated and remove the regime from power. That's where it ended up, because we've been working at this problem for 12 years.
Former National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley speaking with the American Enterprise Institute senior fellow Daniel Pletka at an event marking the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. You can see the entire event at cspan.org. That's also where you can find this program as a podcast. You can also find it wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like more on the stories that are shaping Washington, subscribe to C-SPAN's evening newsletter Word for Word. Just go to cspan.org/connect to subscribe. I'm Gary Sterkoff. Thanks a lot for listening today to Washington Today.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Every day we take your calls live on the air on the news of the day, and we discuss policy issues that impact you. Coming up Tuesday morning, Stephen Gutkowski, founder and editor of The Reload, talks about recent gun policy developments, including House Republicans' hearing on the role of the ATF and President Biden's executive order on gun background checks. And then Steve Clemens, editor-at-large for Semaphore, on global and political news of the day, including Campaign 2024 and domestic unrest in Israel. And we'll talk about the stability of the U.S. banking system and how the recent collapse of banks have impacted smaller banks with Rebecca Romero-Rainey, President and CEO of Independent Community Bankers of America. Watch Washington Journal live at 7 Eastern Tuesday morning on C-SPAN or on C-SPAN Now, our free mobile app. Join the discussion with your phone calls, Facebook comments, texts, and tweets.